Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. It's still broken after all these years. The most dysfunctional in the nation. It's a circus, the Twilight Zone, defiantly bad, a state of shame. It's limbo land. How low can it go? It's New York State government. It's Albany. To guide us through and hopefully past the political and governmental morass that's Albany, and to examine, diagnose, and prescribe for what ails New York is John Faso, a partner in Manatt Phelps Phelps, a law and lobbying firm. He was elected as a Republican assemblyman in 1986 and served as minority leader. He narrowly lost to Alan Hevesy for state controller in 2002, and in 2006, he was the Republican candidate for governor against Eliot Spitzer. Enough said. Diane Savino is a Democrat who represents the 23rd State Senate District, which is in Staten Island and parts of Brooklyn. Before being elected in 2004, Senator Savino was Vice President for Political Action and Legislative Affairs for the Social Service Employees Union, Local 371. Welcome back, John. Welcome, Diane.
Thanks, Doug.
Thank you.
Simply, what are the big problems? And we know we could list them forever. What are, in your minds, the three biggest problems that a governor or legislators, the media, residents and voters should focus on? Diane.
Well, it's kind of hard to describe what are the three biggest problems. I mean,
Go ahead.
Certainly one of the biggest problems that New York State is facing right now is our fiscal state. It's in disarray. You know, our revenues are seriously below where they should be at this point in time. We're operating under a huge deficit. And we have a history of decades of passing on till the next generation the problems that this generation is supposed to deal with in an effort to get us through each budget cycle. And so that kind of sets up the dynamic for what goes on in Albany. But what lays the groundwork for these bad decisions is a really, as you pointed out, dysfunctional system of government, a very strong leadership-driven system, which really relegates legislators who are elected, duly elected people by their districts, sent to Albany to fight for change or make things better or address issues that matter to their constituents. It relegates us to backbenchers in many respects, and unfortunately, most of the decisions are made by one or two or three people.
Okay, so it's economics and politics/government. John, you did a piece in July 26th, in the Wall Street Journal, an op-ed, How to Stop New York's Meltdown. Describe this meltdown, which Diane referred to, and what are some of the correctives that you'd suggest?
Well, the biggest issue we face is the economy, and I would put taxes and debt and spending at the state and local levels. They're simply out of control and not sustainable. New York's meltdown is evidenced in one very salient number, and that is people are fleeing New York. Our population growth is among the lowest of any state in the nation. Upstate New York, if it was its own state, would have the lowest population growth of any state in the United States, except for, I think, for North Dakota and West Virginia. So
not states you want to emulate.
No, and New York's state and local taxes are 50% above the national average. Our local taxes are 70% above the national average. We have a pension system at the state and New York City level that's not sustainable. You have employee retirement obligations that the state, the city, the school districts, the towns owe that is now 160 billion and counting. We have a terribly dysfunctional state and local governance structure. We've got 62 counties, we've got 60-something cities, we've got 700 towns, we have thousands of special purpose districts. We have so much government that people are leaving because they won't pay anymore. Okay. And that's the problem.
Okay. Let's focus then in on the budget. What can be done? What ought to be done, and what is politically and technically feasible to be done? What do you do? You've both described the problem. Let's talk about some ameliorative measures here.
First, recognizing that budgets are not necessarily just financial documents, they're political documents. They reflect the priorities of the budget maker, whoever it happens to be at the time, whether it's a Republican governor or a Democratic governor or an independent. They reflect the priorities of the budget maker. And so the governor sets out his executive budget, which usually is this big long wish list of monopoly money, essentially, in some respects. We're going to pay for all of these wonderful things. New York State does have a history of addressing issues that the federal government has not dealt with, whether it's with respect to health care and access to coverage for more and more people, or whether it's improving our education system. As John, I'm sure, would agree, we spend more on education than any other state in the nation. And a lot of that is shifted down to the localities, and they in turn want to spend more money at the local level as well, and that drives up costs. And so what happens is we have very limited ability to curtail spending because we've committed so much to these goals that people want, whether it's the governor, the legislature itself, or the people that we represent.
Right.
And so when we're faced with serious budget shortfalls like we have right now, you have one of two choices. You either borrow money to cover the cost, which is what the state government has been doing for years, or you cut. Nobody wants to cut. Nobody wants to reduce education spending. Because if you do, that sets up a public outcry.
But don't you have to cut? Don't you have to cut?
You have to. You have to cut because the first thing that should be done is the state spending should match its revenues that are coming in. And
wait a minute.
That would be revolutionary.
Wait a minute.
Well,
you got 130 billion spending, and what is the revenue? 70?
No, that's 130.
Oh, it includes the feds.
Federal dollars.
Right.
If you just look at the budget that is supported by state funds and special funds, et cetera, you're looking at approximately $75 billion. The revenues that come from the taxpayers in the state are dropping precipitously. The next governor who's elected in 2010 is going to walk in and face, today, we know, a $18 to $20 billion budget gap.
This is California size.
This is California style size, and by the way, California has 33 million people, and New York has 19 million people. New York has been way overspending. What needs to be done, frankly, we need to start cutting now, unfortunately, but we also need to start reforming. Diane mentioned education, K through 12. Yes, we all want good quality education. I was the original sponsor of charter schools in the legislature. I fully support those. But there are many of the things that we're spending our school dollars on that aren't really benefiting education.
Example?
Well, to give you an example, there are salaries and contracts, for instance. Even though the private sector is dropping in terms of wages, we are still guaranteeing through what are called step increases, raises for everyone that works in the school system. We can't afford to give raises next year when the private sector economy is actually declining in its income.
Yeah, but that affects the workforce, and then you've got the workers and their unions.
Better to have a job than to be laid off. Better to have a job and keep the same salary than the.
So you're talking about really freezing
salaries. You have to freeze salaries.
Where else do you cut, though? It would seem that you would have to cut in health.
You have to make major changes in the New York's Medicaid system. Those are already ongoing. The problem is, and I think all of us, even fiscal conservatives, would recognize and would tell you that New York has dug itself into such an enormous hole. There are very few options that are going to be, none of the options are going to be easy or palatable, but they're all going to be difficult. But it's going to require real reductions in spending at the state and local level in order to match the spending with our revenues.
I want to pick up on one of the things that John talked about, which was, the negotiated contracts that exist, particularly with teachers, more in the suburbs than in the city of New York, but definitely in the suburbs. And it goes back to one of his earlier comments about the size of local governments, the number of governments we have. We have 700 school districts in the state of New York. Quite frankly, it's absurd. Earlier this year, we did manage to pass legislation to go forward with the government consolidation plan, which sounds like it's a good idea, right? Why do we need so many layers of government? Why do you need 10, 12, or 15 bargaining units in Nassau County? Why do you need another 10 in Suffolk County? Why don't you have regional bargaining, for all school districts? Why do you need so many layers of government? The problem that we then face is, at the local level, people move to the suburbs. It's more the suburbs than anywhere else. They move to the suburbs because they want a certain lifestyle. They want to live in a community that's safe from crime. They want to live in a community that has good schools. They want to live in a community, where the property value is going to rise. And they want to live in a community where they can compete with the next community. And so you have school districts competing against other school districts. I mean, it is not inconceivable for a school district in Westchester to negotiate a starting salary for a teacher of $110,000. Now, is that teacher substantially better than a teacher in Tuckahoe who earns $70,000?
How do you address this?
Part of it is we have to have the nerve to go into our districts and talk about why their property taxes continue to skyrocket. It's not simply what we do on the state level, but it's in collusion with what they do on the local level. If you want to reduce property taxes, you have to do a couple of things. One, I actually believe we should put a cap on property taxes because they are driving people out of the state. But you also have to have an honest conversation with your local school districts, with your local governments and your county governments about how much money they're spending, because they're driving up their property taxes at a much higher rate than we are.
But here's where I think we have to.
Go ahead.
This is where you get into the rub. Unless you deal with the state mandates that dictate how contracts are negotiated, how benefits are paid, you'll never solve this problem. 70% of the cost of running any school, as you would expect, is labor and benefit costs. And so that's where, it's like Willie Sutton said, why did he rob banks? That's where the money was. That's where it is. And what state law does, and we have to reform the Triborough law and the Wicks law and all these other things, what state law does, it drives up the cost of these negotiated contracts and benefits. And I'll give you an example. Just as one, if you want an outrageous example, Buffalo is the most one of the most impoverished places in the state. 90% of their school aid comes from the state of New York. Their teacher's contract has elective cosmetic surgery as a benefit. Elective cosmetic surgery as a benefit. I know this because I served on the control board supervising the city and the school districts. And you can't get rid of it because of the way the laws are rigged in Albany in favor of the public employee unions. The same reason why we need pension reform. Why should someone who makes $100,000, or say someone making $60,000 in their base salary, and they wind up getting overtime in the last 3 years, they rig their final average salary, and they wind up getting a pension that's bigger than their base salary. This happens all over New York State. To do that, you have to change the laws in Albany.
Okay, so you're talking about a Tier 5 pension, you're talking...
And reforms to the system, because it's being ripped off now left and right,
Can
legally.
you respond? Because you're the chair of the Civil Service Committee.
I am the chair of the Civil Service and Pensions Committee.
Former labor leader.
Yes, I am.
Talk to this. Why are the costs high, and is it labor?
Well, there's several reasons why the costs are high. First, with respect to elective surgery in Buffalo, I'm astounded that they actually were able to negotiate that. But negotiation is a two-way street, Doug. There's this perception among some people that the public employee unions have somehow hoodwinked everybody they ever negotiated a contract with. Quite frankly, that's just not true. I mean, when you look over the years, and I'll speak to my own experience, during the period of time from 1990 to 2001, there were several instances where the public sector in New York City took not a 1-0 contract, but a 2-0 contract, reduced starting salary of their incoming workforce by 10%. There was a whole host of concessions that were enacted in an effort to deal with the city's fiscal crisis. So there's a history of both unions and their employers, whether they're on the state level, the county level, or the municipality, negotiating in an effort to reduce expenses. But always there's this desire to preserve the benefits that they've gotten. Healthcare costs are extraordinarily high, not just for government, but for, the private sector. Everyone recognizes that the value of health insurance is sometimes worth more than a wage increase. And so from time to time, you'll see them negotiate around those things. With respect to the pension system itself, I think what gets lost a lot when you begin to talk about people padding their final average salary or rigging the system, there are very hard and fast rules on the use of overtime. Nobody has the right to earn overtime without it being previously approved by their employer, in effect managers.
So this is a management problem as well as a labor problem in your mind.
They utilize overtime to deal with staff shortages.
Should it count for final average salary?
Well, that's a different discussion, John. Now, can we look at changing the calculation method for pensions? Certainly, there's room for discussion about that. You could potentially cap.
If you want to control the costs of government, go ahead.
You could change the law that says that only non-discretionary overtime could be counted towards your final average salary, not discretionary overtime. So for instance, the people who earn the most in overtime, quite frankly, are our emergency services, police and fire, and that's non-discretionary overtime. They don't have the ability to say at the end of their shift, I'm going home. You know, if they're in the midst of investigating a crime or responding to a fire or an ambulance run.
But many
The other
contracts,
places,
many contracts are set up though so that the union picks who gets the overtime. And that exists in police forces and fire departments all around the state.
It's
the
based on
fact is,
seniority. But again,
Well,
those are areas that you could negotiate, and if they are worth something of equal or greater value to either party,
the
those are
patient is
discussions.
on the floor bleeding, and that the patient is the state of New York and its economy. And if we do not make substantial, almost sweeping, radical change in the way in which the government extracts money from the private sector economy, we're not going to have any private sector companies in this state that produce wealth.
I'm not going to disagree with you on that. However, I think blaming a caseworker somewhere in Hudson Valley for the failures of state government, I don't believe is fair. The truth is, you have thousands of public employees in the state of New York who, when they retire, their salary will be somewhere around $18,000 a year. Now, are there people that will have, their pension, I'm sorry. Are there people that have very, lucrative pensions? Yes, they tend to be managers. They tend to be former elected officials. They tend to be mayors.
We could, and I'm not talking about the person who's the caseworker who's making, $30,000 as their final salary. I'm talking about the fact that you have many people who are being paid a base salary of $70,000, $80,000, who are getting pensions of over $100,000, and for 30 years we're going to be supporting.
But Diane wouldn't be adverse to modifying law and procedure to eliminate these more egregious. But you're talking about a more systemic approach.
And we also, CUNY and SUNY have a
don't start picking on us.
A defined contribution plan that has existed for years.
Right.
We should have a defined contribution plan, and certainly an option for defined contributions.
But we have that.
Not at the state and local level.
We
don't.
We have an additional plan. You have a deferred compensation plan.
No, that's different than a retirement plan. And so that is a federally qualified deferred compensation. We should allow local governments and school districts, for instance, to set up a defined a contribution plan, just like SUNY and CUNY professors and employees have. That'll save a lot of money.
Very briefly, in that 18 minutes, we talked about the economy. Let's move from, if you will, the economy, and we talked a little bit about governmental consolidation. Let's now talk about governance, what Diane began to talk about in her opening remarks.
Because, we both were in the minority.
Right.
Even though Diane is now in the majority.
Right.
We both understand how that. We both
well,
understand.
In your case,
we both understand how that works in Albany.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Looking at the bodies, the legislative bodies, you mentioned one of the problems being really strong leadership, and the strong leadership has a really deleterious effect on. So you're suggesting that internal rules that change that and cultural changes are necessary.
I think more of a cultural change. I'm not sure any rules that we pass in Albany are really going to make the kind of change that's necessary to empower legislators. A lot of what we do, even the new rules that we passed at the end of the coup, in some respects are nothing more than window dressing. What's going to change Albany, quite honestly, is that people are going to be willing, who get elected, are going to be willing to go to Albany and challenge the status quo. And they're going to be willing to say, you know what, I'm willing to risk my member item allotment. I'm willing to risk, my capital allotment. I'm willing to risk the office that I have to fight for something I believe in. And there's not enough people that feel that way yet. They are there in Albany. There are several members in both parties, quite frankly. There are good people in the Republican conference. There are good people in the Democratic conference who are, quite frankly, mortified about what happened.
Well, you were part of a group of 6 that included both Democrats and Republicans that try to work out or at least talk to one another.
I think the worst outcome for what happened in the state Senate this summer was that the Democratic conference was reorganized back to its 32. We would have been much better off as a Senate, as a body, as a state government, if we had been able to negotiate that power sharing deal
When
with
it was
31
31-31.
31. It would have forced us to finally do something that none
Wow.
of us have wanted to do for a long time, which is negotiate.
Interesting. Deadlock as a pathway to negotiation.
Well,
Very interesting.
I think Senator Savino says is accurate in her depiction of the situation. One of the things that I had proposed, I was a former minority leader, and so I was one of those legislative leaders, and I understand the benefits and burdens of that. One of the things that I had proposed when I was running for governor in '06 was term limits, not just for statewide elected officials, 2 terms for statewide elected officials, but also for the legislative leaders in Albany. I think term limits would force legislative leaders to be more responsive to their constituency within the House, but they would also encourage more people, more churning of potential new leaders coming up through the system. So it doesn't become such a permanent sinecure. One of the other things, though, that Diane said about members being willing to forego their member items, you know what? We're not going to have the money to pay for member items the way certainly
they'll find the money.
They'll always find
They'll
the
find
money,
the money,
That's
John.
the
Come on.
problem,
But-
because
but-
that's how you control this body.
But when you're in a situation where you're looking at, we have a current year deficit of over $2 billion. Next year it's probably about 6, and the year after it's
said
18 billion. This is the kind of sword of Damocles that is over the heads of all New Yorkers, and that's what I think is missing in all of this discussion. We can use the word dysfunction, etc. Yes, the legislature needs change and reform, but more than anything else, if we don't fundamentally change the way in which we tax and borrow and spend in New York State, there aren't going to be the private sector businesses left in New York to pay the taxes.
Talk about the real elephant in the room, an elephant and a party symbol in a Senate
There's
sense.
a donkey and an elephant.
That's right.
Yeah.
Gerrymandering.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
one of the recommendations out there is to have an independent, either nonpartisan or,
well, I don't
if
know.
necessary,
I agree that there should be reforms and standards. For instance,
but you still want the houses to
I
draw
think,
their own boundaries?
I think that if you have some independent group or commission, I think we're kidding ourselves if we say that they're all going to not have their own biases and political point of view. I think if you have an outside group do it or the legislature do it, the key is to restrict them by statute and by constitution as to how they can
what the criteria
are, because
Contiguous,
it doesn't
right.
matter. You know, there's my former assembly seat, for instance, is now divided among 7 different counties in upstate New York. It's it takes this poor guy 2.5 hours to drive from one end to the other. So there's no virtue on either side here. Republicans have done it, Democrats have done it, and what my experience over 25 years of observing this, what you need are standards to limit whoever draws the line.
Talk to the gerrymandering and term limits issue briefly, Diane.
Well, with respect to gerrymandering, I absolutely agree with John on this, and you have to kind of look at if the 2 majorities in 2002 had not conspired to rig, districts, to benefit both the majorities in both houses, we wouldn't have 62 members of the New York State Senate.
Right, you would have had 61.
We would have had 61.
Right, because
and
they made up that Brooklyn
district.
district.
This crisis earlier this year. But, it's this history of, okay, we'll protect you if you protect us, that has really led to, a crisis that came about several years later. But, I mean, I represent, like John said, his old district is 7 counties. I represent a bi-borough district. Now, certainly it's not 7 counties, it's 2 counties. But think about this.
But your district is really bizarrely
it's
drawn.
one of the most
it's
gerrymandered you've ever seen.
Totally bizarre.
In an effort to create that 62nd Senate seat that would always be held by a Republican.
Marty Golden's
But
seat.
it crosses, think about it's a New York City seat, 2 counties, certainly nowhere near the size of geography.
Right.
But I cross 8 assembly districts, 7 city council seats, 3 congressional districts.
And you've got
That's absurd.
Sunset Park, Bensonhurst, and the North Island, Staten Island. It's like the world. Talk about diversity.
And truthfully, it is unfair to the people that I represent, because their communities have no connection to each other.
Right.
They're divided either by water or by
Culture.
huge zip codes and cultures.
Right.
And so that so it makes it that much harder for somebody to represent them effectively. And
That's
so
why standards are
standards
important
have
in
to be
terms
important.
of geography, community of interest, existing political or community district boundaries, whatever you wanted to say.
We have formal criteria in the New York City Charter that do much the same thing that you're suggesting.
And I would point out, though, the skeptic in me points out that we don't have it nirvana in New York City
No,
government
this is
either.
true.
So,
Okay.
So let's not make people think this is the be all and end
Okay.
all.
We've got a minute. We come back in a year, the three of us. What's happened? Any of it good?
Well, in a
15
year from now,
seconds.
it'll be primary day in New York City for state officers. It is very possible that many members in the Senate will face primaries in both parties, unless we do something good in the upcoming legislative session, particularly with respect to the budget. And that's going to require us to work together to try and solve some of the complex problems that we know exist, the budget being the most important issue, how to recreate an economy in upstate, and that's really what we have to do, recreate an economy that doesn't exist anymore. And if we can do those things, maybe all of this will have been worth it. And if we can't, we run the risk of potentially being voted out of office.
15 seconds.
The economy is going to be the issue. I think that there's a real question as to whether or not we can take the level of tripling the national debt and at the national level and the burden that we're facing here in New York, and it's going to be a very contentious, vigorous 2010.
Oh, and the one thing we didn't talk about is the Constitutional Convention. You'll have to come back and we'll have to talk about the state of the Republican Party. There's so much, but thanks to my guest, New York State Senator Diane Savino and former New York State Assemblyman John Faso, for being on the show today. Next week, my guest will be Michael Mulgrew, the newly elected President of the United Federation of Teachers. Tune in. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.